Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for attending or tuning into our 15th episode of the Peaceable Kingdom Hour, which is titled The Gluttony Restriction. My name is Matthew A. King, and I am your host. This live stream is made possible in collaboration with allcreatures.org, leading the way in faith based vegan animal rights since 1998, and with the Christian Animal Rights Association, a non denominational Bible based ministry. All opinions and teachings expressed in this series are the commentaries of me, Matthew A. King. And so, with the teaching agenda today, I'm going to go over first give a disclaimer as usual, and then I'm going to talk about Genesis 1 just for a little bit of context, and then we'll talk a little bit about historical context, which is about food circumstances in the ancient Near East. Then we'll discuss the main portion, which is Numbers 11, 4 to 34, and then the commentary on that, as well as the text that modify that or discuss that. Numbers 11, which is Psalm 78, 17 to 31, and 106, 13 to 15. Then I'm going to talk about plagues from God, about how they're usually a punishment for sin and disobedience, like the 10 plagues of Egypt, for instance. Then I'll focus on objections to my statements, like there's a focus on 1 Corinthians 10, as well as the objections of Exodus 16 and Deuteronomy 12. And then I'll discuss how this relates to us today, which is plagues that are caused by meat eating today. Then I'll talk about commentary from a Torah scholar, as well as commentary from Bible scholars to close out everything. And so first, the usual disclaimer, because this discusses slaughter of animals and eating animals, this can be a little bit graphic and a little bit disturbing. And so if there's any portion that you feel upset by, or if there's anything that bothers you, feel free to step out at any time. There's of course no pressure to listen any further. It's just what the Bible says, and so we're just trying to find redemptive understandings of it. And so if you feel free to step out at any time if you need to. And so with that, the first thing we need to do to understand Numbers 11 is to look at Genesis 1. And so, what did God command in Genesis 1 about what is our proper diet and what does he want us to eat? Genesis 1:29 to 31, it says, I have provided all kinds of grain and all kinds of fruit for you to eat. But for all the wild animals and for all the birds, I have provided grass and leafy plants for food. And it was done. Then God looked over all he had made, and he saw that it was very good. And evening passed and morning came, marking the sixth day. And so God designed us to eat grain and fruit, and also it's expanded upon later, basically all plants are what God wants us to eat. And so God's idea of a perfect diet and a perfect creation is vegan for humans and animals. Only the plants are designed as food. And then much later, consecrated meat was allowed, which is meat that's obtained from animal sacrifices. And so consecrated meat came from animal sacrifices. And then consecrated meat was first permitted as a concession to humanity's evil heart. And that's Genesis 8:20 to 9:4, but was later fulfilled in Christ. And so consecrated meat, which is meat from animal sacrifices, is now and forever symbolic. And so that's an important understanding to this too, is because people will say, like, well, with Numbers 11, there was the animal sacrifices and the meat eating during that, but that's something else entirely different. That's not secular meat. Animal sacrifices are now and forever spiritual sacrifices, and so there's no more literal animal sacrifices or literal consecrated meat. However, secular meat is still on the menu for Christians. And so the dialogue about secular meat, it says secular meat, this is a commentary on it. It's a secular meat, that is to say, animal flesh consumed for non-religious purposes. This meat, whilst allowable under the law, is regarded unfavorably within Scripture. In its original Hebrew, the language of Deuteronomy 12 associates the permission to kill and eat animals outside the sacrificial system with lust, wickedness, law-breaking, rebellion against God, and the fall. And so this secular meat is very much frowned upon. It's basically meat that's obtained outside of animal sacrifices. And there's the source for that too, by the way, from Sarks. But basically, yeah, secular meat was obtained outside the sacrificial procedures to God. And so this is the type of meat this is the only type of meat available today for Christians. And so, but I want to, make clear too that there was a time and a place for secular meat. For instance, when the crops would not grow, like during droughts and famines, etc. And it's important to understand too that a lot of times we'll project our idea of meat upon a culture from long ago. And so in order to understand what meat was to these people, we need to look at it through their eyes about who lived back then. And so, like, I'm going to focus here on context where food circumstances in the ancient Near East, and that's important to understand, is because we today we have refrigeration, we have electricity, we have supermarkets, we have fast food restaurants. Nearly, virtually no one in America is underfed, and so it's this idea that we need to understand what it was in the ancient Near East. And so they didn't have supermarkets, they didn't have grocery stores, they didn't have electricity, so they didn't have refrigeration, and so the food circumstances were very different back then. And so, like this source here, it says, for centuries, agriculture in the land of Israel was highly dependent on irregular rainfall, making drought and consequent famine of frequent occurrence. And so that's important to understand, is that in biblical times, drought and famine were very common and a very frequent occurrence. And there's the source for that as well. And we can actually see this in the Bible too. Like it mentions famine a lot. Like Genesis 12:10, it says, now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to live there for a while because the famine was severe. And then Genesis 43:1, the famine was severe in the land. 26:1, now there was another famine in the land subsequent to the one that had occurred in Abraham's time, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines at Gerar. And then 41:54, also it says, then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. And then Ruth 1:1, in the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. 2 Kings 18:1-2, it says, later on in the third year of the drought, meanwhile the famine had become very severe in Samaria. And then this one, 1 Kings 8:1, it says, Elisha had told the woman whose son he had brought back to life, take your family and move to some other place, for the Lord has called for a famine on Israel that will last for 7 years. And so for 7 years there was a famine. And then 2 Samuel 21:1, it says, there was a famine during David's reign that lasted for 3 years, so David asked for the Lord about it. And then Amos 4:6, I brought hunger to every city and famine to every town, but still you would not return to me, says the Lord. And then this one is pretty graphic too. This is actually about what people had to do during famines. And so you'll get a picture of this as well. Like in 2 Kings 6:24-29, it says, sometime later, however, King Ben-Hadad of Aram mustered his entire army and besieged Samaria. As a result, there was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long, and this is where it gets graphic, that a donkey's head sold for 80 pieces of silver and a cup of dove's dung sold for 5 pieces of silver. And so these people are so desperate for food that they're buying dung and a donkey's head to try to, do something with food because of this siege or warfare that caused famine. One day, as the king of Israel was walking along the wall of the city, a woman called to him, please help me, my lord the king, he answered. If the Lord doesn't help you, what can I do? I have neither food from the threshing floor nor wine from the press to give you. But then the king asked, what is the matter? And she replied, this woman said to me, come on, let's eat your son today, then we will eat my son tomorrow. So we cooked my son and ate him. Then the next day I said to her, kill your son so we can eat him, but she has hidden her son. And so people are resorting to cannibalism during famine. And, this is something that virtually no American or any other industrialized nation has ever faced today. And then like in Lamentations 2:11-12, my spirit is poured out in agony as I see the desperate plight of my people. Little children and tiny babies are fainting and dying in the streets. They cry out to their mothers, we need food and drink. Their lives ebb away in the streets. They gasp for life as they collapse in their mother's arms. And so that's a picture of, what it was like during a time of famine. Little children, babies are fainting and dying in the street. And then Lamentations 2:20, it says, oh Lord, think about this. Should you treat your own people this way? Should mothers eat their own children, those they once bounced on their knees? And so that becomes a question of, women eating their own children because of how bad the famine is. And then perhaps the most graphic version of this in Lamentations 4:3-5, it says, even the jackals feed their young, but not my people Israel. They ignore their children's cries like ostriches in the desert. The parched tongues of the little ones stick to the roofs of their mouths in thirst. The children cry for bread, but no one has any to give them. And so this is describing a famine. The people who once ate the richest foods now beg in the streets for anything they can get. Those who once wore the finest clothes now search the garbage dumps for food. And then 4:7-10. Our princes once glowed with health. brighter than snow, whiter than milk. Their faces were as ruddy as rubies, their appearance like fine jewels. But now their faces are blacker than soot. No one recognizes them in the streets. Their skin sticks to their bones. It is as dry and hard as wood. Those killed by the sword are better off than those who die of hunger. And so this is describing that famine. Starving, they waste away for lack of food from the fields. And then again, this is a little bit graphic. Tender-hearted women have cooked their own children. They have eaten them to survive the siege. And so what this is describing, there's this famine during siege, and so women have actually resorted to eating their own children to survive. And so this is a world that's very unfamiliar to us too, and that's what I'm trying to say too, is that a lot of times we look at meat and we think, oh, people were just eating meat like we do today. It's a very, very different, very harsh world that virtually none of us have ever had to face, thank goodness. And so, like in Joel 1:4-20, also there was the risk back then of, there was pestilence, or there was these locusts would destroy your crops. So that was also quite common in biblical times. Like Joel 1:4-20, it says, after the cutting locusts finished eating the crops, the swarming locusts took what was left. After them came the hopping locusts, and then the stripping locusts too. Wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you wine drinkers. All the grapes are ruined, and all your sweet wine is gone. A vast army of locusts has invaded my land, a terrible army too numerous to count. Its teeth are like lion's teeth, its fangs like those of a lioness. It has destroyed my grapevines and ruined my fig trees, stripping their bark and destroying it, leaving the branches white and bare. And so it's describing this locust destruction of crops. It says, weep like a bride dressed in black, mourning the death of her husband, for there is no grain or wine to offer at the temple of the Lord, so the priests are in mourning. The ministers of the Lord are weeping. The fields are ruined, the land is stripped bare, the grain is destroyed, the grapes have shriveled, and the olive oil is gone. Despair, all you farmers, wail, all you vine growers. Weep because the wheat and the barley, all the crops of the field are ruined. And so that ends where it's talking about the locust destroying the crops, but then also, this also mixes in a little bit of drought as well. Like it says, the grapevines have dried up and the fig trees have withered. The pomegranate trees, palm trees, and apple trees, all the fruit trees have dried up, and the people's joy has dried up with them. And so this is describing a drought. So because there's no rain, these plants or these crop sources have dried up and withered because there's no water. And the people's, it says, dress yourselves in burlap and weep, you priests. Wail, you who serve before the altar. Come spend the night in burlap, you ministers of my God, for there is no grain or wine to offer at the temple of your God. Announce a time of fasting. Call the people together for a solemn meeting. Bring the leaders and all the people of the land into the temple of the Lord your God and cry out to him there. The day of the Lord is near, the day when destruction comes from the Almighty. How terrible that day will be. Our food disappears before our very eyes. No joyful celebrations are held in the house of our God. And then this describes the drought once more. The seeds die in the parched ground, and the grain crops fail. The barns stand empty, and granaries are abandoned. And so this is the effects of having no water, or there's a drought. The seeds die, and then the grain crops fail. And then it says, this also affects the animals as well. It says, how the animals moan with hunger. The herds of cattle wander about confused because they have no pasture. The flocks of sheep and goats bleat in misery. Lord, help us. The fire has consumed the wilderness pastures, and flames have burned up all the trees. Even the wild animals cry out to you because the streams have dried up, and fire has consumed the wilderness pastures. And so this drought is so bad that streams have dried up, and then fire, because there's no moisture in the air, also fire has consumed the pastures. And so this is a very, very different world from what we're used to, where drought was a common thing, and where people didn't eat because there was no rainfall. And then Jeremiah 14:1-6 also talks about drought. Like, for instance, it says, this message came to Jeremiah from the Lord explaining why he was holding back the rain. And so God in this instance was responsible for this drought. And it says, Judah wilts, commerce at the city gates grinds to a halt. All the people sit on the ground in mourning, and a great cry rises from Jerusalem. The nobles send servants to get water, but all the wells are dry. The servants return with empty pitchers, confused and desperate, covering their heads in grief. And this is where the drought is explicit. It says, the ground is parched and cracked for lack of rain. The farmers are deeply troubled. They too cover their heads. And then also this drought affects the animals too. Again, it says, even the doe abandons her newborn fawn because there is no grass in the field. The wild donkeys stand on the bare hills, panting like thirsty jackals. They strain their eyes looking for grass, but there is none to be found. And so, these droughts and these famines, they very much affected people. And so, obviously, meat would be pretty essential for times when crops would not grow, which was often, quite common. And so, the flesh of animals was very much sort of required back when there was famines and droughts. And this is the time that people would eat animals, is when their crops would fail, because animals were seen as sort of a safety valve. If we have to eat meat, then we will, when there's a time for it. And so, this is confirmed. It says, commentary on biblical eating habits. William Robertson Smith, in Lectures on the Religion of the Semites, he said, so he's basically commenting on biblical eating habits. He said, flesh of domestic animals was eaten only as a luxury or in times of famine. And so that's very different from our world, where, back then people, and also, consecrated meat that was eaten during times of luxury, like, like during feasts and things like that, or celebrations like Passover. That was when that consecrated meat would be eaten, but that secular meat, that was typically only done during times of famine. So that's important to recognize, is that people pretty much only ate meat back then during times when it was necessary. And so that's important to understand too, is, a lot of times we look at our time and we project that back onto people back then, but it's a very nuanced thing where, we have luxuries that they didn't. And we also, I always say too, people back then, they ate meat, maybe 3 times a month because of circumstances. Today we eat meat 3 times a day, especially in America. And so it's gotten out of control. And the thing that the Bible indicates, it says God gets angry when we eat meat when we don't have to. The gluttony restriction is we should not eat meat if we don't have to, or there is no need, like a circumstance like famine or something like that. So, like Numbers 11:4-34, that's the first example of the gluttony restriction on secular meat. This is depicted. And I'm just going to read Numbers 11 for you. I have in previous, I think it was episode 12, if I recall. But anyways, Numbers 11:4-34. Then the foreign rabble who were traveling with the Israelites began to crave the good things of Egypt. And the people of Israel also began to complain. Over some meat, they exclaimed. We remember the fish we used to eat for free in Egypt, and we had all the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic we wanted, but now our appetites are gone. All we ever see is this manna. And so, again, just for context, God is feeding people manna for over a year, and then these people get upset and they want meat to eat. And so this manna is, no question, this is a plant only diet, because God's feeding these people this grain from heaven. It says the manna looked like small coriander seeds, and it was pale yellow like gum resin. The people would go out and gather it from the ground. They made flour by grinding it with hand mills or pounding it in mortars. Then they boiled it in a pot and made it into flat cakes. These cakes tasted like pastries baked with olive oil. The manna came down on the camp with the dew during the night. Moses heard all the family standing in the doorways of the tents whining, and the Lord became extremely angry. Moses was also very aggravated. And Moses said to the Lord, why are you treating me, your servant, so harshly? Have mercy on me. What did I do to deserve the burden of all these people? Did I give birth to them? Did I bring them into the world? Why did I tell them to carry them in my arms like a mother carries a nursing baby? How can I carry them to the land you swore to give their ancestors? Where am I supposed to get meat for all these people? They keep whining to me, saying, give us meat to eat. I can't carry all these people by myself. The load is far too heavy. And Moses said, if this is how you intend to treat me, just go ahead and kill me. Do me a favor and spare me his misery. And so Moses is basically complaining to God, saying, these people, even though you're feeding them manna, they won't stop asking for meat. And God says, I will come down and talk to you there and say to the people, purify yourselves, for tomorrow you will have meat to eat. You were whining, and the Lord heard you when you cried, over some meat. We were better off in Egypt. Now the Lord will give you meat, and you will have to eat it. And it won't be just for a day or 2 or 5 or 10 or even 20. You will eat it. This is where God is very angry. For a whole month, until you gag and are sick of it. For you have rejected the Lord who is here among you, and you have whined to him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? And other translations too, when he says you'll eat it for a whole month until you gag and are sick of it. He also says in another place, or in other translations, more literal translations, you'll be so sick of it, it's coming out of your nostrils. That's something that he says. So it's sort of this like, you're so tired of it that you're actually coughing it up. But Moses responded to the Lord, there are 600,000 foot soldiers here with me, and yet you say, I will give them meat for a whole month. Even if we butchered all our flocks and herds, would that satisfy them? Even if we caught all the fish in the sea, would that be enough? Then the Lord said to Moses, has my arm lost its power? Now you will see whether or not my word comes true. Now the Lord sent a wind that brought quail from the sea and let them fall all around the camp. And so God responds with their request for meat by sending them all these quail that are flying, and they come down in the camp. And it says, for miles in every direction, there was quail flying about 3 feet above the ground. So the people went out and caught quail all that day and night throughout, and all the next day too. So no one gathered less than 50 bushels. They spread the quail all around the camp to dry, but while they were gorging themselves on the meat, this is the important part. So they decide to eat this quail meat. It says, but while they were gorging themselves on the meat, while it was still in their mouths, the anger of the Lord blazed against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. And so these people ate meat, even though they were being fed this abundance of manna. They ate this meat, and then they were killed for it with a plague. So that place was called Kibrot Hatava, which means graves of gluttony, because there they buried the people who had craved meat from Egypt. And so this is where what I call the gluttony restriction comes into play. Is the conclusion we can make from Numbers 11 is God condemns eating meat when we don't need to. These people had an unlimited supply of manna and yet chose to eat meat when they did not have to. And that very much upset God. And then there's a question too about what exactly is manna. And I sort of focused on that earlier, but what is manna? Psalm 78:24 says he rained down manna for them to eat, and he gave them bread from heaven. And then Numbers 11:7-9 also, it says it fell on the camp at night along with the dew. The next morning, the people would go around and gather the manna, grind it or pound it into flour, and then boil it and make it into flat cakes. It tasted like bread baked with olive oil. And so this is really no dispute that this is a plant food. In conclusion, manna is a vegan food. It's only made from plants. And this is indicated as, they make it basically into a flour. It tasted like bread. It's baked with olive oil. It's like coriander seeds. This is obviously no dispute a plant food. And one particular person commented on this. This isn't just my interpretation. This isn't some like novel idea. This is a very ancient interpretation. Like it says here from a very respected Torah scholar. Note the following key points from a vegetarian point of view. He's talking about Numbers 11, 4-34. God wanted the people to be sustained on manna. He was displeased when they cried for flesh to eat. Perhaps the many deaths due to the plague were intended to teach the Israelites that they should not eat meat, and if they did, it would have dire consequences. The place where this incident occurred was named the Graves of Lust, to indicate that the strong desire for flesh led to the many deaths. Numbers 11:34. While manna, their staple food in the desert, kept the Israelites in good health for 40 years, many deaths occurred when they deviated from this simple diet. And that was the greatly respected Richard H. Schwartz that wrote this article in the Times of Israel. And then, Numbers 11:4 is not the only time that this incident is discussed. Like further biblical verses or passages talk about this. Like in Psalm 78:17-31, it recounts what happens in Numbers 11. It can give us a little bit more information about what happened. Like it says, yet they sinned still more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. And so what did they crave? It was meat. And so this is an instance I like to say too, where eating meat is actually a rebellion against God. It says rebelling against the Most High in the desert. He doesn't want us to eat meat. And so when we do, we rebel against him. So meat is associated with rebellion. And then it says, can God spread a table in the wilderness? He struck the rock so that water gushed out and streams overflowed. Can he also give bread or provide meat for his people? Therefore, when the Lord heard, he was full of wrath. A fire was kindled against Jacob. His anger rose against Israel because they did not believe in God and did not trust his saving power. So that was another reason why the Israelites were killed, is because they did not believe in God and did not trust him to save them. That's one aspect of it. And it says, yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them grain of heaven. And so this is this manna again being discussed. Man ate the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens. And so again, he's sending them food. I'm sorry, that's the part I wanted to focus on. Man ate the bread of the angels, which is the manna. And this is the important part. He sent them food in abundance. And so they had an abundance of food in Numbers 11 with this manna. They had no qualms whatsoever with their food. They had no issues. Inherently, they had food in abundance. They could eat whenever they wanted, the manna. He caused the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power, he let out the south wind. He rained, and this is where it gets to the meat. He rained meat on them like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. He let them fall in the midst of their camp, all around their dwellings. And they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. But before they had satisfied their craving, while the food was still in their mouths, the anger of God rose against them, and he killed the strongest of them and laid low the young men of Israel. And so this recounts that Numbers 11:4 incident where they had satisfied their craving of meat, and then while it was still being eaten, God actually killed them with a plague. And that's what Numbers or Psalm 78:17-31 says. And so with Numbers 11 and Psalm 78, there's a conclusion we can make about, what is the case for meat. And based on the conditions of the time, it's obvious, I think, from Numbers 11 and Psalm 78 that there's a time and a place where you might need meat, where you could eat it in times of famine, in times of desperation. But outside of those reasons, it's not really justifiable. Like Andrew Lindsay here, he made a good conclusion. He said the biblical case for vegetarianism or veganism does not rest on the view that killing may never be allowable in the eyes of God, rather on the view that killing is always a grave matter. When we have to kill to live, we may do so, but when we do not, we should live otherwise. And that's what sort of Numbers 11 definitely teaches. And that was Andrew Lindsay in Animal Theology, he concluded. And that's an important recognition of that, is that, when we eat meat when we don't need to, there are consequences for that. And it's God showing us that we don't need to do that. And then like Psalm 106:13-15, that expands upon, also in Numbers 11 and Psalm 78, it references that event. It says, but they soon forgot what he had done and did not wait for his plan to unfold. In the desert, they gave in to their craving of meat. In the wilderness, they put God to the test. So he gave them what they asked for, but he sent a plague along with it. And so this particular focus is, why did God send a plague? What was he trying to teach us? And if we look at the entire breadth of the Bible, plagues are often sent from God as a punishment for sin or disobedience. And that's important to recognize. Like, for instance, in Exodus 5:3, there's many examples of this, and I'll go through them. But Exodus 5:3, it says, the God of the Hebrews has met with us, they declared. So let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness so we can offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. If we don't, he will kill us with a plague or with a sword. And so they were supposed to journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to God. And if they didn't, they knew that he would kill them with a plague or with a sword. That's another punishment. And then Leviticus 26:25, it says, I will send armies against you to carry out the curse of the covenant you have broken. And so because people have broken the curse of the covenant that God had between his people, it says, when you run to your towns for safety, I will send a plague to destroy you there, and you will be handed over to your enemies. And so this plague was a result of them breaking the covenant. And then Numbers 25:3, in this way, Israel joined in the worship of Baal of Peor, causing the Lord's anger to blaze against his people. And so because people worship this false god or this idol of Baal of Peor, there was Numbers 25:8-9 says that the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but not before 24,000 people had died. And so this plague was sent to them because they worship Baal. And then Deuteronomy 32:21, it says, they have roused my jealousy by worshiping things that are not God. They have provoked my anger with their useless idols. And so because of the Israelites' idol worship, they were punished. Deuteronomy 32:24 says, I will send wasting famine against them, consuming pestilence and deadly plague. And so because of their worship of idols, they were killed with a deadly plague. And then there's other examples beyond that, like Genesis 12:17. It says, the Lord sent terrible plagues upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And that was a punishment for Abram's lie in Genesis 12:18-19. And so a plague was sent to Pharaoh and his household. And Jeremiah 24:8, it says, the rotten figs stand for King Zedekiah of Judah, his officials, and all the others. And then 24:10, I will send a plague against them until they are destroyed from the land I gave them. And so because of these people's character of rottenness, they were sent a plague. And then there's punishment for not following God's instructions, so disobedience, Jeremiah 29:16. And then 29:17 said, yes, this is what the Lord Almighty says, I will send the sword, famine, and plague against them. And then through Jeremiah, there's 14:7, although our sins testify against us, for we have rebelled, we have sinned against you. And so this rebellion or sinning against, in 14:10, it says the result of that, so the Lord does not accept them, he will now remember their wickedness and punish them for their sins. In 14:12, that punishment for sin or disobedience is, I will destroy them with the sword, famine, and plague. And so plague was often a punishment for sins. And then Ezekiel talks about this as well, like in 6:11-12. This is what the sovereign Lord says: strike your hand together and stamp your feet and cry out, alas, because of all the wicked and detestable practices of the people of Israel. For they will fall by the sword, famine, and plague. One who is far away will die of the plague, so I will pour out my wrath on them. And so, because of all the wicked and detestable practices of the people, they would be punished with a plague. And Ezekiel 7:8-9, likewise, it says, I'm about to pour out my wrath on you and spend my anger against you. I will judge you according to your conduct and repay you for all your detestable practices. So for detestable practices, it says, I will not spare you. I will repay you for your conduct and for all the detestable practices among you. And for those detestable practices, God punishes them in Ezekiel 7:15. It says, outside is the sword, inside are plague and famine. Those in the country will die by the sword. Those in the city will be devoured by famine and plague. And then a little bit of this, Ezekiel 14:6 says, therefore say to the people of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says, repent, turn from your idols and renounce all your detestable practices, or else, it says, son of man, if a country sins against me by being unfaithful, and then 14:19, if I send you a plague into that land and pour out my wrath on it through bloodshed, killing its people and the animals. And then 14:21, for this is what the sovereign Lord says, how much worse will it be when I send against Jerusalem my 4 dreadful judgments, sword, famine, wild beasts, and plague to kill its men. And so the results of being unfaithful or worshiping pagan idols was a plague. And then that brings us also to the most important or the most well-known discussion on plagues, which is the 10 plagues of Egypt in Exodus 7-12. And there's consequences of disobedience. Yeah, the 10 plagues of Egypt in Exodus 7-12, that's the consequences of disobedience is what that shows. Like in Exodus 7:14, it says, then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is stubborn, and he still refuses to let the people go. So because Pharaoh wouldn't let the people go, I won't mention, by the way, it's just Exodus 7-12, so you know where it's at. But because he wouldn't let the people go in 7:17, this is what the Lord says, I will show you that I am the Lord. Look, I will strike the water of the Nile with this staff in my hand, and the river will turn to blood. So the river turns to blood because of Pharaoh's disobedience. And then all the Egyptians dug along the riverbank to find drinking water, and they couldn't drink the water from the Nile because it had turned to blood. Then the Lord said to Moses, go back to Pharaoh and announce to him, this is what the Lord says, let my people go so they can worship me. So he requested Pharaoh lets the people go. If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs across your entire land. So Aaron raised his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the whole land. Pharaoh saw that relief had come. He became stubborn. He refused to listen to Moses and Aaron. So the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, raise your staff and strike the ground. The dust will turn into swarms of gnats throughout the land of Egypt. And so Aaron raised his hand, struck the ground with his staff, and then gnats infested the entire land, covering the Egyptians and their animals. All the dust in the land of Egypt turned into gnats. And so there's all these punishments for disobeying God. This is what the Lord says, let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse, then I will send swarms of flies on you, your officials, your people, and all the houses. And so then the Egyptian homes will be filled with flies, and all the ground will be covered with them. And so the Lord did just as he had said. A thick swarm of flies filled Pharaoh's palace and the house of his officials. The whole land of Egypt was thrown into chaos by the flies. And so God requests again, go back to Pharaoh. The Lord commanded Moses, tell him, this is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews says, let my people go so they can worship me. And then it says, if you continue to hold them and refuse to let them go, the hand of your Lord will strike all your livestock, your horses, donkeys, camels, cattle, sheep, and goats with a deadly plague. And that's unfortunate there too, because the animals get killed, but it's a result of not obeying God. And the Lord did just as he had said. The next morning, all the livestock of the Egyptians died, but the Israelites didn't lose a single animal. But even so, Pharaoh's heart remained stubborn, and he still refused to let the people go. So the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, take handfuls of soot from a brick kiln and have Moses toss it into the air while Pharaoh watches. And so the ashes were spread like fine dust over the whole land of Egypt, causing festering boils to break out on people and animals throughout the land. And that's another important too, is that, this didn't happen to Pharaoh, but it happened to, the people and the animals in the land. And so that's what it's trying to say too, is that our disobedience often causes nightmares for other people as well, and not just ourselves. So they took soot from a black kiln and went and stood before Pharaoh. As Pharaoh watched Moses threw the soot into the air, and boils broke out on people and animals alike. Even the magicians were unable to stand before Moses because the boils had broken out on them and all the Egyptians. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh. Tell him, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says: Let my people go so they can worship me. If you don't, I will send more plagues on you and your officials and your people. Then you will know that there is no one like me in all the earth.' Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Lift your hand toward the sky so that hail may fall on the people, the livestock, and all the plants throughout the land of Egypt.' So here's another punishment. So Moses lifted his staff toward the sky, and the Lord sent thunder and hail and lightning flashed toward the earth. The Lord sent a tremendous hailstorm against all the land of Egypt. Never in all the history of Egypt had there been a storm like that, with such devastating hail and continuous lightning. It left all of Egypt in ruins. The hail struck down everything in the open field. People, animals, and plants alike, even the trees were destroyed. And so Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says: How long will you refuse to submit to me? Let my people go so they can worship me. If you refuse, watch out, for tomorrow I will bring a swarm of locusts on your country.'" So here again is this punishment of pestilence. "They will cover the land so that you won't be able to see the ground. They will devour what little is left of your crops after the hailstorm, including all the trees growing in the fields. They will overrun your palaces and the homes of your officials and all the houses in Egypt. Never in the history of Egypt have your ancestors seen a plague like this one." And so then Pharaoh says in Exodus 10:11, "Never, only the men may go and worship the Lord, since that is what you requested." And so Pharaoh makes a little bit of a concession and says, "Okay, only the men are allowed to go worship God. That's it." And so then the Lord said to Moses, "Raise your hand over the land of Egypt to bring on the locusts. Let them cover the land and devour every plant that survived the hailstorm." So Moses raised his staff over Egypt, and the Lord caused an east wind to blow over the land, similar to the the quail blew over the east wind, to blow over the land and all that day and throughout the night. When morning arrived, the east wind had brought the locusts, and the locusts swarmed over the whole land of Egypt, settling in dense swarms from one end of the country to the other. It was the worst locust plague in Egyptian history, and there has never been another one like it. For the locusts covered the whole country and darkened the land. They devoured every plant in the fields and all the fruit on the trees that had survived the hailstorm. Not a single leaf was left on the trees and plants throughout the land of Egypt. Pharaoh quickly summoned Moses and Aaron. "I have sinned against the Lord your God and against you," he confessed. And so then moving on to, "But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart again, so he refused to let the people go. Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Lift your hand toward heaven, and the land of Egypt will be covered with a darkness so thick you can feel it.' And so Moses lifted his hand to the sky, and a deep darkness covered the entire land of Egypt for 3 days. During all that time, the people could not see each other, and no one moved. But there was light. There was light as usual where the people of Israel lived. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let the Israelites leaving the country, so continuing to disobey. And that night at midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn sons in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn son of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn son of the prisoner in the dungeon. Even the firstborn of their livestock were killed. Pharaoh and all of his officials and all the people of Egypt woke up during the night, and loud wailing was heard throughout the land of Egypt. There was not a single house where someone had not died. Pharaoh sent for Moses and Aaron during the night. 'Get out,' he ordered. 'Leave my people, and take the rest of the Israelites with you. Go and worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and be gone. Go, but bless me as you leave.'" Yeah, and so the point of all that is Pharaoh kept disobeying, and then God unleashed these plagues upon him and his country, and it affected all the humans and animals in it. And so that's the cost of our disobedience. And so, like one source says, it says, God also warned his people of the consequences of disobedience, including plagues. And they cite Leviticus 26:21 and 25. And so there's other verses also that condemn this gluttonous eating of meat in Numbers 11. And so the overall point I had too was that plagues are often plagues are often sent from God by a consequence or a punishment for disobedience. And so, like in Numbers 11:33 to 34, again, it says, "But while they were gorging themselves on the meat, while it was still in their mouths, the anger of the Lord blazed against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague." So these people ate meat and then were punished for it with a plague. So that place was called Kibrot-Hatava, which means graves of gluttony, because they had buried the people who had craved meat from Egypt. And so there's also other verses that seemingly confirm what this is talking about. Um, like Proverbs 23:20 to 21. it says here, be not among drunkards or among gluttonous eaters of meat, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and slumber will clothe them with rags. And so this is mentioning that Numbers 11 verse, which is says, be not among gluttonous eaters of meat, or those who eat meat when they don't need to. And that's a little bit tenuous, my understanding, because the word for gluttony is not the same one that's used in Numbers 11:34. But they can also use words that um, that convey the message as well. There's also that possibility, and so it's tenuous, but it's possible. And so I often use that to say that. But then there's an objection to this. Like, a lot of people will say, the most common thing you'll see, like on a lot of Christian websites, is the objection is in Numbers 11 and related passages. God was not condemning the meat eating itself; He was condemning man's ungratefulness. So you actually see this in a very common, very popular Christian website. It says, so God did not bring judgment on the people for eating the quail, but because of their lustful and ungrateful hearts. And that's from Defending Inerrancy. But what they don't realize is 1 Corinthians 10:3-6 shows that Numbers 11 was about meat eating when they did not have to. And that's very clear here. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10:19-24, what am I trying to say? Am I saying that food offered to idols has some significance, or that idols are real gods? No, not at all. I'm saying that these sacrifices are offered to demons, not to God. And I don't want you to participate with demons. You cannot drink from the cup of the Lord and from the cup of demons too. You cannot eat at the Lord's table and at the table of demons too. You say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. You say, I am allowed to do anything, but not everything is beneficial. And so here's the important part. In 10:25, before this, he was talking about eating meat that had been sacrificed to idols, which are demons. But then 10:25 says, eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience. And so he's saying that this meat is acceptable from possibly idolatry associated pagan idols. If the meat was sacrificed to, or the animal was sacrificed to an idol, and then people ate it afterwards at a market, after it had been associated with idol worship, it was fine to eat. They could eat it without any ground of conscience or any issue ethically. But what's often misunderstood or often taken out of context at the very beginning of that chapter, and also 1 Corinthians 10:27-28, if someone who isn't a believer asks you home for dinner, accept the invitation if you want to. Eat whatever is offered to you without raising questions of conscience. But suppose someone tells you this meat was offered to an idol, don't eat it out of consideration for the conscience of one who told you. And so it's about this sensitivity about, if someone is offended by this meat might have been offered in sacrifice, don't eat it because it might offend somebody. And this is about meat that was offered to pagan idols. But what's often taken out of context here, though, is in 1 Corinthians 10:3-6, this shows how Numbers 11 is about the actual meat eating, because Paul says here in 1 Corinthians 10:3-6, at the very beginning of the chapter, all ate the same spiritual bread and drank from the same spiritual drink. So he's talking about the people eating the manna in Numbers 11. They drank from the spiritual rock that went with them, and that rock was Christ himself. But even then, God was not pleased with most of them. And so their dead bodies were scattered over the desert. So he's referencing Numbers 11 here, where the people ate meat when they didn't have to, and then they were killed for it. And then he says here, now these things took place as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil as they did. And what's interesting here is he's saying that so that they do not desire evil. What is evil? They desired meat to eat. And so Paul, because he's talking about that entire chapter is about meat eating, he's saying that don't be like the Israelites who ate meat when they didn't need to and then were killed for it. And so he's warning them. Paul is connecting the secular meat eating with evil. He's also implying that the Corinthians better require the meat, or else they may end up dead like the people who ate the quail in Numbers 11. And that's what's fascinating about that, is that, a lot of Christians will say, oh, well, that wasn't about the meat after all, but Paul directly links that with meat. And there's commentary, actually, that's very, very minority, unfortunately, of a very small minority of scholars have acknowledged this, even though it's pretty obvious. It says, they lusted, this is commentary on 1 Corinthians 10:6. This author said, they lusted after flesh, and God granted them their desires. And the consequence was a plague and the destruction of multitudes. So Paul infers that the Corinthian Christians should not lust after or desire the meat offered in sacrifice to idols, lest it should lead them also to sin and ruin. And so that's from commentaries from Bible Hub. And so they even acknowledge that Paul infers that the Corinthian Christians should not lust after or desire the meat offered in sacrifices to idols, or it will lead them also to sin and ruin. And so that's the point, is that these people ate meat when they didn't need to. And Paul doesn't want these people to do that either. And then another objection is God fed the Israelites quail meat in one instance that happened over a year before Numbers 11:4-34. And this is true. Like in Exodus 16:8, it says, this is about a year before Numbers 11 happened. It says, then Moses added, the Lord will give you meat to eat in the evening and bread to satisfy you in the morning, for he has heard all the complaints against him. I have heard the Israelites' complaints. Now tell them, in the evening you will have meat to eat, and in the morning you have all the bread you want. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening, vast number of quail flew in and covered the camp. And so he feeds these people quail right after the Exodus. They're traveling to Israel, and the quail, he does give them quail to eat in this instance. But then the context, if you look here in Exodus 16:3, it says, if only the Lord had killed us back in Egypt, they moaned. We sat around pots filled with meat and all the bread we wanted, but now you have brought us into this wilderness to starve us all to death. And so the Israelites, that's the important context here. They were starving to death. They had just left Egypt after there had been famine, all these plagues where they couldn't eat crops because of locusts. And so it says the feeding to the Israelites aligns with the gluttony restriction because God fed them meat when they were starving in this instance. And so meat is acceptable because they're starving. And so that's the time when meat is acceptable. But then also there's an objection here, and this is kind of funny actually. This is one of my favorite verses because a lot of people will bring this up and say, oh, well, no, God doesn't have any problem with meat eating because look what he says in Deuteronomy 12:15-16. It says, however, you may slaughter and eat meat within any of your towns as much as you desire. And here's the important part. That word desire comes from the Hebrew word avah, according to the blessing of the Lord your God has given you. The unclean and the clean may eat of it, as of the gazelle and as of the deer. Only you shall not eat the blood. You shall pour it out on the earth like water. And then Deuteronomy 12:20-21 also states, when the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you crave, there's that word again, avah, meat. You may eat meat whenever you desire, avah. And so this sort of looks like it conflicts with what I'm saying, because it says, God says, enlarge your territory as he has promised you, and you say, I will eat meat because you crave meat. You may eat meat whenever you desire. And then he says, if the place that the Lord your God will choose to put his name there is too far from you, then this is talking about consecrated and then secular meat, then you may kill any of your herd or your flock, which the Lord has given you, as I have commanded you, and you may eat within your towns wherever you desire. And there's avah again. And so throughout this, he keeps saying, when God enlarges your territory as he has promised you and says, I will eat meat because you crave avah, meat, and you may eat meat whenever you desire. So why would God say you can eat meat whenever you desire if he doesn't like it when we don't eat it when we don't need to? But it's important to recognize here, and this is really funny. It says desire and crave are translated from the Hebrew word ava or ava. And this is actually referencing Numbers 11:34. Numbers comes before Deuteronomy. Numbers 11:34. Therefore, the name of that place was called Kibrot Hatava, because there they buried the people who had the craving, avah. And so within Deuteronomy 12:15-16 and Deuteronomy 12:20-21, God's actually referencing Numbers 11:34. And he's actually being facetious and sarcastic. Deuteronomy 12:15-16, 12:20-21 is God being facetious and sarcastic. It's basically God saying the modern equivalent or the ancient equivalent of F around and find out. And so it's like F around and find out, if you're unfamiliar. That's this phrase that a lot of modern audiences use. It's basically a taunt, a threat, or a warning given when someone or something commits to an action or course that will certainly lead to negative repercussions. And so, and that's from Urban Dictionary, by the way. But Deuteronomy 12:15-16 and 12:20-21 is God giving a warning that if one eats meat when they have no need, they'll end up like the quail eaters of Numbers 11. He uses the exact same word about Kibrot Hatava, graves of lust. They'll end up, if they eat meat when they don't need to, they'll be struck by a plague and killed. And so he's being sarcastic there. It's funny because he says, oh yeah, eat meat whenever you desire. But if you eat it when you desire it, you'll be killed like the Israelites were with a plague. And so, he's basically taunting and saying, go ahead, see what happens. See what happens. It's that F around and find out. And so I always laugh because a lot of Christians will say, oh, look what God says in Deuteronomy 12. He says I can eat meat whenever I desire. And I'm like, no, you You don't understand what that means. um, and so what this leads to is, what does this mean today? And God's warning still resonates today because meat eating is linked to plagues, pandemics, and epidemics. Humanity's lust for meat has created pandemics and epidemics, and that's important to recognize. Like, for instance, and it's also too about amount. It's like the ordinary food of the average. I'm sorry, it says here from a pretty reliable source. It says the ordinary food of the average Hebrew of Bible times was bread, olive oil, buttermilk, cheese from their flocks, fruits and vegetables from the orchards and gardens, and meat on rare occasions. So meat on rare occasions, that's important to understand, is like it said, is meat was very rare in biblical times. And like I said, it was typically during famines and plagues, or famine and droughts. And that's the source there. But then in contrast, we look at today, it says according to the USDA, the average US resident consumes 224.6 pounds of meat, beef, pork, broilers, and turkey every year. And so that's a very, very big difference. The average, I would say the average Israelite ate, 5 pounds of meat a year. Now it's 224 pounds of meat per year for Americans. And that's, what is that? Uh, 500 times greater than what they ate in biblical times. And there's a cost to that. The way people eat all around the world, including in the US, is a major risk factor for pandemics too, is what this source says. It says that's because we eat a ton of meat and the vast majority of it comes from factory farms. In these huge industrialized facilities that supply more than 90% of meat globally and around 99% of America's meat, animals are tightly packed together and live under harsh and unsanitary conditions. So as you probably know, factory farming is where this is. And it says bird flu is caused by viruses, and it's a massive risk coming out of factory farms, as is swine flu. That's both because the birds in these farms are squeezed together by the thousands in close proximity and because they're bred to be almost identically genetically. That's a recipe for a highly virulent virus to emerge, spread, and kill rapidly. And then that's the source there. And then you might be familiar with mad cow disease. That's another disease coming, another plague from meat eating. It says VCJD, which is variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It says it's a rare fatal brain disease that occurs in people. It has been linked to eating meat from cows infected with another prion disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE. BSE is sometimes called mad cow disease. And then there's also HIV and AIDS. That's also contrary to popular belief. That actually came from animals as well. It says most AIDS researchers believe that the bushmeat trade allowed the HIV-1 virus and separately HIV-2 to enter the human bloodstream several times. Hunters who kill and butcher chimps and monkeys are regularly exposed to animal blood teeming with SIVs. If the hunters have cuts, bites, or scratches, and given the nature of their work, they almost always do, they can catch the viruses from their prey. And so that's the theory about HIV and AIDS, is it came into humanity through killing and eating chimpanzees and monkeys. And then there's also SARS. You might remember SARS from 2002, sudden acute respiratory syndrome. It says SARS-CoV-1, which was, that was the designation of it, which sprang out of a large, crowded, wet or live animal market in Guangdong, China in 2002, should have taught us something. Thought to have originated in bats, the SARS coronavirus possibly amplified in civet cats, an animal farmed for the luxury wild meat trade in China before jumping into the human population. And so the way that we treat animals and the way that we crave meat ends up with killing us with a lot of diseases and, causing a lot of misery. And then also, probably the most recent example, of course, that everybody's familiar with, it says COVID pandemic started in Wuhan market animals after all, suggests latest study. And I know that the COVID lab leak theory is very popular, but what I always say is that would be unprecedented and probably unlikely. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it would be unlikely just because most viruses come from the way that we confine and kill and torture animals. And so COVID probably isn't any different. But yeah, like I said, COVID pandemic started in Wuhan markets after all, suggests latest study. Researchers have identified half a dozen animal species that could have passed SARS-CoV-2, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19, to people by reanalyzing genomes collected from an animal market in Wuhan, China. And that was a recent article. And so the important thing to understand too is unlike people in biblical times, we generally have an abundance of food with supermarkets, restaurants, and refrigeration. Humanity today is like the desert quail eaters of Numbers 11, eating meat almost exclusively when we have no need. It's purely out of gluttony and habit, not necessity, like, famine or drought. And so one hypothesis that, of course comes to mind is, are these plagues like COVID, like SARS, like HIV, like um, swine and bird flu, are these plagues a divine punishment for meat eating? And it's impossible to know for sure, but I think the possibility is high that pandemics, epidemics, and plagues today are a direct result of humanity's lust and gluttony for lust and gluttony for meat. And I don't necessarily think it's God smiting people with his finger or something like that, but I think it's because plagues are sort of built into the fabric of the consequences of exploiting and harming animals. So I think that's really what it's trying to say too, is that perhaps God designed it that way, that if you do this to animals, there's going to be consequences to it. It's much like putting your hand to a fire. You're going to get burned. It's just the fabric of the way God designs it for our safety, our benefit, and also to the animal's safety and benefit. And there's an author I actually wanted to talk about that he discusses this in 3 different articles. He's a good friend of mine, but he said the Torah's disturbing. And actually, this is really important too, because this is a Torah scholar, very knowledgeable about the Torah, which is the Torah, for anybody that might not know too. That's the first 5 books of the Bible for Christians. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And he says here in his article, he makes the connection about Numbers 11. He says the Torah's disturbing message, killing animals for food, some rabbis tell us, is a manifestation of human lust, not of the divine will. Last Shabbat, we read of one of the most dramatic and disturbing stories in all of the Torah, a story that is more relevant today than ever before. The story recounted in chapter 11 of the book of Numbers finds the Israelites wandering after the Exodus. They had been living on manna, described in the Torah as like coriander seed. A group of the Israelites, referred to pejoratively as riffraff, began clamoring for meat. Moses then relays the request to God that that's when things get really interesting. God tells Moses, and this is a direct translation, the Eternal will give you meat to eat until it comes out of your nostrils. Then strong winds blew quail into the Israelite camp. The riffraff feasted. Here's the disturbing part. God smote the quail eaters with a deadly plague. And as if the message were not clear enough, the Torah tells us that the dead were buried in Kibrot Hatava, the graves of lust. It is tempting to interpret this story in a very general way, as merely a warning against being ungrateful for God's beneficence. But there is a specific meaning that is highly relevant to our contemporary condition, a meaning that becomes crystal clear when the story is viewed in the context of the entire Torah. God's first dietary instructions to us, given in Genesis 1:29, were eat plants and only plants. In other words, we were commanded to be vegetarians or even vegans. Only after humanity had sunk into a state of spiritual depravity did God grant us limited permission to kill animals for food. In Genesis 9, after the Exodus in the desert, God tried again to impose a plant-based diet, only to be frustrated by the riffraff. Fast forward to Deuteronomy 12, God gives the Hebrews their final marching orders before they enter the land of Israel and tells them that they may eat meat because of their te'avah, their lust. The linguistic link to Numbers 11 has not escaped the notice of some of our greatest rabbis. And I talked about that, about how God was being sarcastic there. Killing animals for food, they tell us, is a manifestation of human lust, not of the divine will. What does this have to do with today, with us? The treatment of animals in modern industrial agriculture is so abhorrent that no ethical system, especially ours, can justify it. Any one of us would be horrified to experience firsthand the conditions in a chicken farm where literally tens of thousands of birds are crammed together in a windowless warehouse, never to experience fresh air or sunshine, never mind even a minute with their mothers. Moreover, because of the human preference for white meat, the chickens are bred to grow such enormous breasts that their skeletal and cardiovascular systems often cannot support the weight, causing crippling pain and even heart attacks. And in recent weeks, farmers have intentionally suffocated millions of chickens in an attempt to contain yet another outbreak of bird flu. The good news is that we can do more than just lament the situation. At the grocery store and in restaurants, we can make compassionate choices from among the ever-growing array of plant-based options. Then we'll be living up to the divine will and enjoying delicious food in peace of mind, undisturbed. And that's my good friend Jeffrey Spitz Cohan. He talked about this in the Jewish Chronicle, where he connects Numbers 11 with this plagues of eating meat. And then another article he wrote, it says the laws of kashrut, one or both what I'm about to say are true. There's no doubt that the laws of kashrut make it difficult, as we say in Judaism, a pain in the tuchus to eat meat, right? And this is a reference to last week, the kosher restrictions. But he says you have to have separate dishes and in often cases separate sinks and kitchen appliances. You can only get your meat at a certain store. You have to time carefully so you're not eating meat too close to when you're eating dairy. It's actually a pain. People adapt to it, but it's a pain, and it was meant to be a pain. It's also understood by many rabbis, including some of the ones I named a few minutes ago, that the laws of kashrut were designed to wean Jews off of meat altogether and to get back to the ideal of Genesis 1:29. And in case you doubt that, when God was in control of what the Jews were eating, this is a reference to Numbers 11 again, which was the case when they were in the desert after leaving Egypt and before getting to Israel. When God was in control, they were on a vegan diet. It's described in the Torah as like coriander seed, so there's no dispute it was a plant food. I really commend your listeners to read Numbers chapter 11 in the Bible, which is a very dramatic story in the Bible that rabbis and ministers and Sunday school teachers tend to gloss over because it makes them very uncomfortable if they're a meat eater. But in Numbers 11, when a group of the Israelites in the desert complained about the manna and demanded meat, God gave them meat all right and then killed them in a plague. If that message wasn't clear enough, the Torah said they were buried in the graves of lust. Yes, it was certainly a precursor of the health issues that the standard American diet is producing today. And that's, again, Jeff Cohan. He had that in Responsible Eating and Living. And then this was written right around COVID when it started. He makes a great point here. It says, did the Torah warn us about COVID-19? Animal consumption leads to deadly plagues. A few people saw it coming. This COVID-19 pandemic, there were epidemiologists and immunologists who sounded alarms about the coronavirus within days or weeks of its first appearance. Going back quite a bit further, there was a journalist and author, David Quayman, who in his highly respected book, Spillover, expressed concern in 2012 that the next major epidemic would emerge from an animal market in China. But it's not a stretch at all to say we were warned about this possibility 3,000 years ago in the Torah. There is a story in the Bible that most rabbis, pastors, priests, and ministers usually ignore or gloss over, much to the detriment of their congregations and of humanity as a whole. In the story found in Numbers 11, a large subset of the Moses-led Israelites dies in a gruesome plague after they have eaten meat. The new coronavirus appears to have first entered the human population at a live slaughter meat market in Wuhan, China. The parallels are rather obvious. As the biblical story goes, the Israelites, after escaping from Egypt, found themselves in a vast desert without available food sources. This opened the door for God to reinstitute the original divine directive found in Genesis 1:29 to eat plants and only plants. God fed the Israelites a single, health-sustaining food, manna. In the Torah, manna is compared to coriander seed. What happened next is no different than what would happen today. People began complaining about the absence of meat. The whiners were just a subset of the Israelites, but there was enough of them to provoke Moses to turn to God for help. Moses says, "Excuse me, God, they're asking for meat. What am I supposed to do?" God says, "No worries, Moses, I got this. If they want meat, I'll give them meat until it's coming out of their nostrils." A strong wind began to blow and something began to fall from the sky, but it wasn't rain, it was quail. The meat-craving Israelites happily gorged themselves. It would be their last meal. They died in a sudden plague, and if the message that God didn't want people to eat meat wasn't clear enough, there is this. The meat-eaters who ate quail and died in a plague were buried in Kibrotatava, the graves of gluttony. There are at least two ways to view the Torah. If your view is the literal word of God, then the message of Numbers 11 is crystal clear. God was absolutely furious that people were clamoring for animal flesh. After all, we're told in Genesis 1 to consume an animal-free diet, and we're told in Genesis 2 that God created animals to be Adam's companions, not his food source. And then he says here, if you instead view the Torah as a metaphysical interpretation of historical events, then the story really gets interesting. So he's saying here, if you interpret it as like an atheist would look at it from metaphysical point of view, like where he's saying that, this event didn't actually happen as described. It was just based on a kernel of truth, which was that there was a plague. And, there was no supernatural intervention. It was just an interpretation of what actually happened. And so he says, viewed this way, a group of Israelites diverged from the communal diet and hunted quail. The quail eaters caught a virus from the quail and died rather quickly. This interpretation is not so far-fetched. Quail have been identified as a major source of the deadly avian influenzas that have circulated through ports of Asia over the past dozen years. For some versions of these influenzas, the fatality rate for humans has exceeded 50%. Whichever interpretation you prefer, we have to concede we were warned that the consumption of animals would lead to deadly plagues. Warned 3,000 years ago. To be clear, the COVID-19 pandemic should never be viewed as a divine punishment. And that's where I would disagree with him there. I do think that it might be a divine punishment. Rather, the pandemic can be viewed as something we were warned would happen if humanity continues to confine, kill, and consume animals. Will we finally heed the warning? And that's, again, my friend Jeffrey Spitz-Cohen. He had some great commentary there in the Jewish Chronicle that was posted. And then finally, there's some commentary from another biblical scholar. She says here, the state of the mind has largely to do with the health of the body and especially with the health of the digestive organs. As a general thing, the Lord did not provide his people with flesh meat in the desert because he knew that the use of this diet would create disease and insubordination. In order to modify the disposition and bring the higher powers of the mind into active exercise, he gave them angels' food, manna from heaven. And that's Ellen G. White in SDA Bible Commentary, Volume 1. And then she had some more commentary on Numbers 11. Like she said here, God continued to feed the Hebrew host with the bread rain from heaven, but they were not satisfied. Their depraved appetites craved meat, which God in his wisdom had withheld in a great measure from them. They would not be content with the healthful food which God had provided for them. Their depraved appetites craved a greater variety, especially flesh meats. In this instance, the Lord gave the people that which was not for their best good because they would not have it. Because they would have it. They would not submit to receive from the Lord those things which would prove for their good. They gave themselves up to seditious murmurings against Moses and against the Lord because they did not receive those things which would prove an injury to them. Their depraved appetites controlled them, and God gave them flesh meats as they desired, and he let them suffer the results of gratifying their lustful appetites. Burning fevers cut down very large numbers of the people. Those who had been most guilty in their murmurings were slain as soon as they tasted the meat for which they had lusted. If they had submitted to have the Lord select their food for them, and there had been thankful and satisfied for food which they could eat freely of without injury, they would not have lost the favor of God and had been punished for their rebellious murmurings by great numbers of them being slain. When God led the children of Israel out of Egypt, it was his purpose to establish them in the land of Canaan, a pure, happy, healthy people. And then she talks about in Numbers 11 here, let us look at the means by which he would accomplish this. He subjected them to a course of discipline, which, had it been cheerfully followed, would have resulted in good both to themselves and their posterity. He removed flesh food from them in a great measure. He had granted them flesh in answer to their clamors just before reaching Sinai, but it was furnished for only one day. God might have provided flesh as easily as manna, but a restriction was placed upon the people for their good. It was his purpose to supply them with food better suited to their wants than their feverish diet, to which many of them had been accustomed to in Egypt. The perverted appetite was to be brought into a more healthy state, that they might enjoy the food originally provided for man, the fruit of the earth which God gave to Adam and Eve in Eden. Had they been willing to deny appetite in obedience to his restrictions, feebleness and disease would have been unknown among them. Their descendants would have possessed physical and mental strength. They would have had clear perceptions of truth and duty, keen discrimination, and sound judgment, but they were unwilling to submit to God's requirements, and they failed to reach the standard he had set for them and to receive the blessings that might have been theirs. They murmured at God's restrictions and lusted after the flesh pots of Egypt. God let them have flesh, but it proved a curse to them. And also, just for a little bit of context too, Ellen G. White ran what's known as, or really Seventh-day Adventists ran what's known as Battle Creek Sanitarium, and so that was a place where people would go to for medicinal assistance, or like a hospital, a clinic to improve their health. And so she references here. It says the sickness that has visited many families in Battle Creek need not have been if they had followed the light God had given them. Like ancient Israel, they have disregarded the light and could see no more necessity of restricting their appetite than did ancient Israel. The children of man would have flesh meats, and said, as many now say, we shall die without meat. God gave rebellious Israel flesh, but his curse was with it. Thousands of them died while the meat they desired was between their teeth. And then she references 1 Corinthians 10:6 here with Paul. We have the example of ancient Israel and the warning for us not to do as they did. Their history of unbelief and rebellion is left on record as a special warning that we should not follow their examples of murmuring at God's requirements. God has spoken in the history of the children of Israel for whom for their good he sought to withhold a flesh diet. He fed them with bread from heaven. Man did not eat angels' food, but they encouraged. I'm sorry, man did eat angels' food, but they encouraged their earthly appetite. And the more they centered their thoughts upon the flesh pots of Egypt, the more they hated the food which God gave them to keep them in health, physically, mentally, and morally. And that was the manna she's referencing. And then finally, she says, they longed for the flesh pots, and in this they did just as many in our own time have done. And they longed for the flesh pots, and in this they did just as many in our own time have done. And that's Ellen G. White in Counsels on Diets and Food. And she was the one of the founders of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which, advocates for a vegan diet based on, the Bible and what it says and what I'm talking about here. And then there's also another Seventh-day Adventist that's pretty well known. He said here, the divine ideal of a meat-free diet was not totally forgotten later in the Bible. When Israel was in the wilderness in need of food, God provided manna. When they insisted on eating meat, the Lord gave them quail, but the result was sickness. And he references Numbers 11, 4-23, 31-33. And that's Angel Manuel Rodriguez. And there's the source for that. And then that was all I had for today. Did anybody have any questions too that if anything wasn't clear, I can provide a little bit more about before I close out in prayer? Just let me know. And I'll say a quick prayer too. Thank you, Heavenly Father, for giving your instructions, which leads to the best outcomes. And thank you for your solemn wisdom and letting us know that meat leads to a lot of destruction for us and the creatures of the earth, and also the general world. And help us to follow your will, which is a plant-only diet, and help us to avoid meat, which is detrimental to our health and detrimental to the animals and the world itself. And help us to strive for your goal of a world where no one is harmed and no one eats meat. And I didn't see any questions come through. So thank you guys so much for attending. And I hope you have a great week. And then next week, I'll be here talking about the animal cruelty restriction. And so I will see you next week. Have a great day and have a blessed Sunday.